Hello and welcome friends. In Indian Economy Unit 5 Industrial Policy, up till now we have had a brief look at what industrial policies are and what all areas do they cover. We talked about the 1956 industrial policy, and we also then followed that discussion up with another discussion on industrial policy of 1991, wherein we talked about the LPG, the liberalization, privatization and the globalization aspect. We also talked about how industrial policy made some provisions with respect to public sector and with respect to delicensing, with respect to lifting the licensing requirements in many of the sectors, the aspect which we know as privatization and liberalization. In the last session that we had, we talked about trade liberalization, and we understood that this is related to the globalization aspect of the industrial policy of 1991. Now we are going to discuss the failures of the industrial policy. If somebody asks you to critically evaluate the industrial policy of 1991, this is what you are going to talk about. Domestic firms could not withstand competition. Now you know that it was made easier for the foreign firms to set up their units here in India. In some sectors, for example, have a look at what we discussed in the last session. Some sectors, there was automatic approval for foreign equity participation up to 51%, and it was basically made easier for the foreign firms to come to in India, right? Because of it, so many foreign firms came up in India, and the domestic firms were not able to withstand this competition. They were not able to compete with these firms. Example can be taken of Videocon. And before 2000s, Videocon was among a dominant player as far as the white goods industry is concerned, be it the washing machines, be it the television. But then once we had foreign firms coming up and setting up their units here in India and selling their products here in India, ultimately Videocon lost its market share. They lost their market share as far as televisions are concerned. Why? Because they were still using the outdated, old technologies, obsolete technologies, while the foreign firms had access to the latest of the technologies. And secondly, since earlier they didn't have any competition from foreign firms, they didn't have any solid competition coming in, they became a little complacent, and many a times they did not prioritize the satisfaction of the customers. So the moment there was some competition from foreign firms, the customers also switched to these firms which were selling them products which were qualitatively superior and were also taking special care to satisfy these customers. So companies like Videocon, they lost their market share. Again, you would recall that the provision regarding the foreign capital, which we have discussed in the last session that we had yesterday, therein we discussed that the foreign equity participation was allowed only in priority industries, right? Have a look at the provision here. Up to 51% permitted in high priority industries, right? It was not allowed in all the kinds of industries. But then what actually happened was, though the provision was that foreign majority ownership would be allowed in high priority industries, high priority sectors, but eventually the foreign capital was allowed. Foreign ownership was also allowed in low priority industries. For example, clothing, ready to eat food products. They are not priority industries. They are not vital for the economy of the country. So the provision was made only with respect to high priority industries, which are very, very important for the economy of the country. But then eventually in such low priority areas also, foreign majority ownership was allowed, which in a sense was a failure of the industrial policy of 1991. Then offloading targets. I hope you recall our discussion on the provisions of industrial policy of 1991 with respect to the public sector enterprises, and therein we said that the majority ownership of government was to be sold off to some private player in case of those PSUs which were making losses on a consistent basis. This is something that we have already discussed in the session that we had earlier. Now these offloading targets were not realized, which means not all the loss-making PSUs could be privatized, could be sold to private firms, could be sold to private enterprises. The ownership of the government still remained in many of such loss-making PSUs. So offloading means basically selling away the sick, low priority sector, public sector enterprises, right? Low priority. Now, what do we mean by low priority? Only those public sector enterprises were sold which were also sick and also belong to the low priority sector of the economy. So they had to be sold to the private players. But these targets were not met, and many of such low priority sector, chronically sick enterprises continued in the public sector. They continued to work under the ownership of the governments. And what is the reason that such targets could not be met? The major reason was that there was huge opposition from workers, from the labor unions. Why? Because these labor unions were worried that once the loss-making PSU in which they are working, the ownership gets transferred to some private player, the private player would certainly want to improve the efficiency levels, would certainly want to improve the functioning of the organization. It may so happen that in the process, the private owner would terminate the services of some of the employees. So the workers were very much against this particular move by the government, and they opposed it tooth and nail, and that is why so many loss-making units could not be privatized. And you would see that in later years also, gradually many such units which could not be privatized after the industrial policy in 1991, they were gradually privatized or sold to private players gradually in later years after 2010, 2020. Then another reason why some of the public sector enterprises could not be sold, that they were incurring losses for the government exchequer, was that there was a growing perception among the public that these public assets are being sold to private sector at throwaway prices. So many a times there was this perception among the public that these public sector units, public sector enterprises, which are basically owned by the government, they are being sold away to private players at throwaway prices, at very cheap prices. And this was happening because of the collusion, because of the bureaucracy, because of tacit approval by the bureaucracy. So the bureaucracy was thought to be involved in the selling up of these government-owned enterprises, public sector units, to private firms, to private capital. And it was thought by the public that this is being done in a corrupt manner, right? For example, there were some cases which actually strengthened this perception. For example, the UP State Cement Corporation, which was a loss-making public sector enterprise, it was sold to the Dalmia Group, a private player, at 1/6 of its asset value, which meant, just to give an example, if the value, the total worth of all the assets of UP State Cement Corporation at that point of time was rupees 100, it was sold to Dalmia Group at just rupees 16 or rupees 17. So these kind of things which happened, they also further strengthened this perception that the public sector enterprises are being sold away at dirt cheap prices to the private players. And this led to even more opposition against privatization of public sector enterprises, even though they were making losses. And that is why in some cases what happened, another innovation came up, wherein instead of selling the public sector enterprises to some private player, many instances the ownership and the management was transferred over to the workers. For example, this happened in case of Kamani Tubes, which was again a sick unit, a loss-making unit. The unit was not sold to any private firm, but the ownership was transferred to the workers. not only the ownership but the management also transferred to the workers. So this took care of the concerns of the labor union that the jobs would be lost once the units are privatized. And secondly, this also took care of this particular perception also, that these public sector enterprises are being sold away to those private players which are greasing the hands of the bureaucrats, which are indulging in corruption, which are bribing the bureaucrats. So both these aspects were taken care of through this particular model, wherein some public sector units which were making losses were sold away to the owners. Now, the major criticism of industrial policy in 1991 is that it led to a decade of growth, but it led to a decade of jobless growth. Prior to 1991, if you look at the annual GDP growth figures of the country, you would have found out that 3 to 4% or at most 4.5% was the annual growth rate, and which was many a times mocked at by calling it the Hindu rate of growth. Why? Because people generally in the Hindu families generally used to have 4 or 5 children. So that growth rate of 4 to 5% or around 3% was mocked at by the commentators, by the critics as the Hindu growth rate. But 1991, once the industrial policy was unveiled and it was implemented, after that you can compare the GDP figures and you would find that the GDP growth rate of 6%, 8%, 8.5%, 8.3% were also realized in the later years. But this growth was jobless, which meant that there was no matching increase in the number of jobs in the country, in the number of employment that was available in the country. So there was a growth, but that growth was not accompanied with equivalent growth in the number of jobs in the economy, right? Why? Because the economic growth model was not labor intensive. I hope you recall our discussion in Unit 2, wherein I talked about the contribution of the manufacturing sector to the economic health of the country, to the GDP of the country, and you would find that the contribution has remained almost stagnant to somewhere around 23-24%. While in the service sector the contribution has grown, but by their nature manufacturing industries, the secondary sector is generally more labor intensive. But because the manufacturing sector could not grow a lot, it could not increase its contribution to the economic health of the country, to the GDP of the country, the growth in the jobs also was not witnessed, because manufacturing sector had the capacity to generate jobs, but it was not growing that much. On the other hand, service sector enterprises, which many a times, some of them at least, are not as labor intensive as the manufacturing sector, they grew a lot, but their growth was not accompanied with an equivalent growth in the number of jobs available in the country. So this happened post 1991, and this is considered to be a major failure of the reforms of the industrial policy of 1991, or the reforms which are unleashed by the industrial policy of 1991. Fine. So with this we conclude our discussion on industrial policies. In this particular unit 5, we only had to talk about industrial policy 1956 and 1991. Let me remind you once again that there were industrial policies. The first industrial policy was unleashed in 1948, which was then followed by the 1956 policy, and then there were 1977 and 1980 industrial policies, and then came the eventual 1991 industrial policy. But then we have not discussed the 48, 77 and 80. So we have focused on industrial policies of 1956 and 1991, since they only have been mentioned in the syllabus. To talk about and to know about the industrial policies of 48, 77 and 80, you can refer to your business environment notes in the second semester. Thank you very much for your time.